When I say, "Oh, do you believe in God?" and they say, "Well, I don't believe in God because when I was young, my grandma passed away, and she was such a lovely lady that when she passed away, I decided I wasn't going to believe in God anymore." So if your grandma hadn't died, would you believe in God then? And then they think, they say,
This is a place, something that isn't Jannah, it's not hellfire, it's in between. And that contrast is required for there to be a clarification of the good and bad.
we have to realize that Allah's attribute is that Allah is all wise, Allah is forgiving, Allah has these attributes. And so you can't start judging things where, so I often do hear people say, for example, when I say, "Oh, do you believe in God?" and they say, "Well, actually, I don't believe in God because when I was young, my grandma passed away prematurely, and she was such a lovely lady that when she passed away, I decided I wasn't going to believe in God anymore." Do you actually, does that resonate with you, Doctor? Have you heard this sort of thing before?
Yeah, I think that this idea that somehow this is a utopia and God should have created this world to be a black paradise, and because it's not that, and because there's difficulty and suffering, whatever that might be, my cat died, therefore I'm not I don't believe in God. That sort of attitude is common and it's misplaced. It's sort of a variation of the suffering argument that if the God, if there was a God and he was all powerful and all good, then why is there any suffering in the world? Either he doesn't want it, or he's not. Either he doesn't want it, and he can't change it. And that means he's not all powerful, or he has no power to change it, or he
Mm,
wants it and therefore he's sort of not all good. And this sort of a strange argument doesn't make a difference to our
mm,
paradigm, because the conception of God in this way of thinking is basically a straw man. We don't believe God
mm,
is just two attributes.
mm, mm, mm.
And so, yeah, this is quite common, and
Yeah,
unfortunately, it's repeated a lot. We get a lot of, even the Dawkins of the world, etc.
yeah,
They all
yeah,
talk about how my cat died essentially, and therefore I'm not
yeah.
too
But
hard on
what I
it.
find very interesting is whenever I've said to somebody that, so if your grandma hadn't died, would you believe in God then? And then they say, no, probably not. So then clearly the reason actually wasn't the fact that you experienced something bad in your life, but you're perhaps just using that as maybe one reason, but it certainly isn't the only reason, and it certainly isn't a major reason. So anyway, we've got guests in the back. Abu Laith, if you want to have your camera on so we can identify you, and then once we identify you, we'll bring you on. You can turn your camera off, of course, before you come on, but we do need your camera on, please, if that's okay. So I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? So when you do actually then pose the question, so if this experience that you had that you say in effect, made you, or stopped you from believing in God, had if we take that experience away, would that change anything? And the reality is that most people would say no, it wouldn't. In fact, I've not heard a single person who said yes, it would. For example,
Yeah,
so
so it's mostly the emotional response to the event, and then they project this, and then they later on they come up, they rationalize it, and so the rationalization is something after the event of being upset, or even being someone who hates God for what happened, which is an odd
yeah,
thing to do, to hate something that you don't believe exists.
yeah.
But anyway, we won't
Yeah.
go there.
So look, we do get quite a lot of ex-Muslims who are watching the show. We often find that they're making comments. Why don't you come on and explain to us why it was that you actually left Islam? I think it'd be an interesting discussion. And of course, if you are Muslim and you've had doubts, or somebody's presented a doubt to you, then it would be a good way to perhaps clear that up and allow people to learn from that. One of the things that Doctor, some Muslims will sometimes say is, and it's the same question that often comes up quite a lot, which is that why would Allah create people that are going to go to hellfire? It doesn't make sense to me. He knows that they're going to go to hellfire, then why bother to create them in the first place? So that's a common one that I've heard, and even amongst Muslims, they come up with these type of arguments. What would you say to somebody like that who presents that argument to you?
So I think this is so there's a lots of things to be addressed in this sort of question, and the fundamental question really is that what do you think you're created for? What is the purpose of your creation? And what is the nature of God? Is he just or unjust? And is it an arbitrary thing where you're going to end up? Like as soon as before you're created, you're going to be in hell or you're going to be in heaven. There's nothing that you did or can do to contribute to that, the outcome of this thing. And I think that when you start to delve into the assumptions in this sort of thinking, then you come to realize actually no, this isn't an unfair or unjust thing. This is based upon the actions the individual will do in their lives that will lead them to be judged in the way that they're judged, and their destination to be their final destination. So the fact that Allah knows this beforehand, and this is because God is all-knowing definitionally, then that has no issue about whether or not it's adjusting or not adjusting where you end up. The other thing is that what kind of a world are you trying to envisage? So you can either envisage a world in which there is pure bliss and there's happiness and no one does anything wrong, and we call that Jannah. Yeah. So this is not here. This is something that's as a reward. And actually, you can conceive of the opposite world in which there is only punishment and suffering and torture, and there's nothing good that can happen at all. And that's the hellfire. Yeah. This is not either of those. This is a place, something that isn't Jannah. It's not hellfire. It's in between. And this is a place of testing. And what you see here is both the things, good and bad. And that contrast is required for there to be a clarification of the good and bad. And this is why you can't see if you get a whiteboard and you have a white marker and you draw a line on it, you're not going to see it. Wa alaikum assalam, Brother Jordan. Feel free to jump on if you're available. So if you to see the mark on the board, you need really the contrast. You need to only the presence of evil can clarify that the good is around, and only the presence of good can highlight the evil that is around. You can't have in this world. You can't have a world bereft of either of these things, and therefore you're gonna see both of those things. So both of these, our first question and this one, they tend to overlap. But I don't know if people think they take the time to sort of think things through. Alhamdulillah, may Allah make it easy, inshallah.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that what we have to appreciate is that just as with most interpretations of anything out there, whether it's politics, science, whatever it is, you always have some sort of philosophical underpinnings or assumptions before you assess something. So, if you're going to join the Conservative Party, you can't suddenly have all socialist views, because that's the underpinnings or the foundational concepts of that particular party means that in at least some sort of even if it's somewhat loose, but nevertheless overall those assumptions or those values have to be there. Similarly, if you're doing science, for example, we know that you have to accept some form of naturalism, philosophical naturalism, whereby you believe that everything has a naturalistic explanation. Otherwise, you can't do science, because otherwise you'd just say, "Oh, that looks like a miracle," but you can't do that in science. Obviously, you have to keep investigating. So there are certain axioms and foundational concepts that we have in Islam, which is that Allah's attributes, for example, are one of those components. And so anything that we interpret has to be interpreted with those axioms or those foundational beliefs or concepts. So, for example, Allah is merciful. In other words, whatever we therefore see happening, regardless of whether it seems like a punishment or not, nevertheless, it's within the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He is merciful, perfectly merciful. If we see something happening and we're unsure about it, we have to realize that Allah's attribute is that Allah is all wise. Allah is forgiving. Allah has these attributes. And so you can't start judging things where those attributes are either somehow diminished, because of course Allah's attributes are perfect. They can never be diminished. So if you start looking at something and you say, "Oh, this seems intrinsically unfair," but then we know that Allah is perfectly just. So the problem then has to be with you. The problem has to be the way that you're looking at something, not the fact that it somehow intrinsically, definitionally is unjust or unfair, because Allah is not unjust. Allah is perfectly just. So if we get those foundational concepts right, then all of our interpretations actually will fall within those boundaries. And so we won't then make statements or think things about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we have no right to. So what we would then do is, if something does seem alarming, or it seems like, how can this be fair or whatever, one looks at that with the realization that actually I'm looking at this through my eyes, which are tainted, because things taint our vision, whether it's secularism, whether it's liberalism, whether it's feminism, whether it's whatever it might be. Those aspects that influence our lives will taint our vision, and we will see things through those tinted spectacles, as it were. This is why, for example, sometimes sisters will say, oh, this, for example, it seems like the man is getting more money here for inheritance. This is unfair. This is unjust. I should get the same amount. But then, of course, again, this limitation upon viewing something from our own perspectives, which are again tainted and influenced by society. But then when we do a little bit more digging, we realize out of the 14 or so different ways that men and women receive money, I think 11 ways the woman receives more. And then we realize that the man has to do so much more with his money in terms of looking after his wife, his children, his family. They all have rights over that inheritance that he receives, whereas she keeps everything, you see. So now somebody looking at it with a cursory glance, they may think, well, and we have this a lot happening, not just from non-Muslims, even from Muslims coming to us and saying, oh, how is this fair? My brothers are going to get double or what I'm going to get. How this is not fair. This is not just. But what a person should do is say, look, I'm going to look at these things through my spectacles, through the tint that's been covered by society, by my experiences. But I know fundamentally Allah is just, Allah is all fair, Allah is perfectly just. Therefore, there has to be some hikmah, some reasoning behind this. You can investigate the reasons behind things. In Islam, we're completely open to questioning, as long as it's done within etiquettes and manners, of course. One should always ask questions with good manners. Then one can ask. And in Islam, we don't just say, oh, just believe blindly, go away, don't bother me. No, you should be able to get your answers. But